Welcome to Storytime with Killian Flynn. Today's story is The Stranger's Secret by Killian Flynn. This is a drama, suspense, mystery story. The town of Ashbrook had always been the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. A town where secrets didn't stay hidden for long, except for one: the disappearance of Lena Calloway. 30 years had passed since she was last seen leaving her family's general store one rainy afternoon. Her umbrella left open by the roadside, her car still running. No body was ever found, no leads, no answers. Just a whisper of suspicion that someone in town knew more than they were saying. Now, as Ethan Graves stepped out of his old pickup truck and into the fading light of an October evening, he felt all eyes on him. He wasn't from Ashbrook, and that made him a threat. The diner was the first place he saw, a relic from a time when small-town diners meant something. The neon flickered weakly, barely holding on. As he stepped inside, the conversation halted instantly. An old man behind the counter, grizzled and slow-moving, narrowed his eyes. "You lost, stranger?" Ethan met his gaze. "Just passing through." A woman in a waitress uniform, her name tag reading Maggie, studied him carefully before sliding a cup of coffee onto the counter. "Nobody just passes through Ashbrook," she said quietly. Ethan took a slow sip, pretending not to hear the unspoken accusation. Then, from the back of the diner, a voice. "I know who you are." The word sent a chill down his spine, because he had come to Ashbrook for a reason, and he wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Ethan's grip tightened around the coffee cup. The voice had come from a booth in the back, where a man sat alone, his face half hidden in the dim light. He wore a faded denim jacket, his hair slightly unkempt, the look of someone who had seen too much and never quite recovered. Ethan kept his expression unreadable as he slowly turned toward the man. "Do you?" The man gave a slow, knowing smirk. "Oh yeah, you're not here by accident, are you?" The diner fell silent again. The handful of patrons, two elderly men near the window, a middle-aged woman flipping through a newspaper, were no longer pretending not to listen. Maggie, the waitress, shifted uneasily behind the counter. "Mike, don't start!" Mike ignored her. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit, we should talk." Ethan hesitated, but he wasn't about to let this man control the conversation. He slid into the booth, resting his elbows on the table. "You seem to know a lot for someone I've never met." Mike's eyes darkened. "I pay attention? You think you're the first outsider to come poking around about Lena Calloway?" The name hit hard, but Ethan didn't react. "So he knows," "And?" Ethan said. Mike's smirk faded. "And none of them stuck around long." Ethan tilted his head. "Because they left? Or because they disappeared?" Mike didn't answer. A gust of wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The neon sign outside flickered again, almost going out entirely before buzzing weakly back to life. Maggie's voice was softer this time. "Mike, let it go." Mike's gaze lingered on Ethan for another long moment before he leaned back in the booth. "Whatever you're looking for, you're not going to like what you find." Ethan exhaled through his nose, pretending to relax. "I can handle it." Mike's smirk returned, but this time, it didn't reach his eyes. That's what they all said. The tension in the diner lingered, even as conversation slowly resumed around them. A fork clattered against a plate, the sound of a spoon stirring sugar into coffee. All normal things, and yet Ethan could feel the weight of unseen eyes. He took another sip of coffee, keeping his tone casual. "What do you know about Lena?" Mike shook his head. "It's not what I know. It's what people refuse to admit." Ethan's fingers tapped the side of the mug. "And what's that?" Mike glanced toward the counter. Maggie was watching them, her face unreadable. The other customers had returned to their meals, but there was an unnatural stiffness in their movements, as if they were listening too carefully. Mike lowered his voice. "You ever wonder why they never found her body?" Ethan didn't blink. "Because they weren't looking in the right place." Mike chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Or maybe they weren't looking at all." Ethan set his cup down. "You saying someone covered it up?" Mike's smirk vanished. And for the first time since the conversation started, Ethan saw something new in his eyes. "Fear!" Mike exhaled and pushed his chair back. "If you're smart, you'll leave it alone." He stood up, tossing a few crumpled bills on the table. Because if you start digging, someone's gonna make sure you end up just like Lena. Ethan watched him walk out of the diner, the bells on the door jangling in the sudden silence. A moment passed before Maggie finally spoke. "You shouldn't trust him." Ethan turned back to her. "Mike?" She shook her head. "Anyone? This town? It's not the kind of place where people tell the truth." Ethan studied her carefully. There was a sadness in her voice, something unspoken. "She knows more. She's afraid to say it." Ethan pulled out his wallet, placing a few dollars on the counter. "I don't scare easy." Maggie gave a dry laugh, but it lacked any warmth. "That's what they all say?" It was the same phrase Mike had used, and something about that bothered him. Ethan slid out of the booth and headed for the door. As he stepped outside, the cold night air bit into his skin. The streetlights flickered above him, and in the distance, the wind carried the faint echo of something unsettling. A whisper, a name. "Lena!" Ethan turned sharply, scanning the empty street. No one was there, but as he stepped off the curb, something caught his eye. Across the street, in the reflection of the old general store window, a shadow moved. Someone was watching him, and just like that, he knew. He wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he stood frozen on the sidewalk. Across the street, in the reflection of the general store window, the shadow lingered. A tall, thin figure stood half hidden in the alleyway beside the store, watching him. Then it moved, not away, toward him. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pivoted sharply, stepping off the curb, heading straight toward the alley. If someone thought they could silently stalk him, they were about to learn the hard way that Ethan wasn't the kind of man to scare easily. But as he reached the mouth of the alley, the figure was gone. The space was empty, save for a few discarded crates and an old dumpster that reeked of something rotten. Ethan's pulse slowed. Did I imagine it? No, his instincts were sharp. He had seen them. Someone had been there. And now they weren't. He let out a slow breath, scanning the alley for any sign of movement before turning back toward the street. Across the way, the diner's neon sign flickered weakly, casting brief pulses of red light onto the pavement. Through the window, Maggie was still behind the counter, pretending not to look in his direction. She was watching, so was everyone else. Ethan turned and walked away. The motel on the edge of town was the only place to stay in Ashbrook. It was the kind of place where the walls were thin, the water pressure was terrible, and the scent of cigarette smoke never really left the room, no matter how long it had been aired out. Ethan didn't mind. He'd stayed in worse. The desk clerk, a balding man with sunken eyes and a beer gut, barely looked up from his television when Ethan approached the counter. "One night?" the clerk asked, as if already assuming Ethan wouldn't stay longer. Ethan pulled out his wallet. "Make it a week." The clerk finally looked at him then, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You sure about that?" Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. "Yeah, I am." The man shrugged, took Ethan's money, and handed him a faded key with a plastic tag that read, "Room 12. No refunds." Of course not. The motel room was exactly as he expected. Dimly lit, slightly damp, and carrying the ghost of 1,000 cigarette breaks. Ethan locked the door behind him and set his bag down on the rickety wooden chair beside the bed. He wasn't planning on sleeping. Not yet. Instead, he pulled out his laptop, placed it on the desk, and powered it on. A few seconds later, the screen glowed to life. No Wi-Fi, no signal. Ethan exhaled sharply. Figures. Luckily, he didn't need internet for what he was about to do. He inserted a USB drive into the laptop, pulling up the files he had gathered before coming to Ashbrook. The screen filled with old newspaper articles, scanned police reports, and blurred photos. And at the center of them all, Lena Calloway. Ethan stared at her face. A young woman with wide green eyes and dark brown hair, frozen in time. The last picture ever taken of her was a candid shot in front of her family's general store, 2 days before she vanished. There were no photos after that, just missing person reports and dead-end theories. But Ethan wasn't interested in theories. He was interested in the truth, and he knew something the town didn't. Because Lena Calloway's case wasn't just another disappearance, it was a cover-up. A soft noise snapped him out of his thoughts. A creak, the unmistakable sound of a footstep outside his door. Ethan's body went still. He reached for his pistol, a small, discreet weapon he kept holstered at his hip, before moving silently to the window. The motel parking lot was empty except for his truck and a single flickering streetlight. But someone was there. He could feel it. Ethan turned the knob on the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Another creak. Closer this time. Someone was standing right outside his door. Ethan waited, heartbeat steady, grip firm on the pistol. Then, a faint knock. Not hurried, not frantic. Just 3 slow, deliberate taps. Ethan said nothing. He stood in the shadows, waiting. Then, just as quietly as it had come, the presence outside his door disappeared. No footsteps retreating, no sound of a car leaving, just silence. Ethan stayed motionless for a full minute before stepping toward the door. He unlocked it, cracking it open just an inch. The hallway was empty, but on the ground, placed directly in front of his door, was a single folded piece of paper. Ethan reached down and picked it up. Inside, scrawled in rough, uneven handwriting, were just 4 words. "Leave before it's too late." Ethan's jaw tightened. Whoever left the note had made one big mistake. They thought he was the kind of man who listened to warnings. They were wrong. Ethan wasn't leaving. Not until he found out what really happened to Lena Calloway. And he had a feeling that Ashbrook was just getting started. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, the note burning in his hands. "Leave before it's too late." The words felt more like a promise than a warning. He had seen plenty of threats before. Angry letters, anonymous emails, phone calls in the dead of night. But this was different. This note wasn't trying to scare him away. It was trying to save him. And that meant someone in Ashbrook knew the truth. Ethan tucked the note into his pocket and checked his gun, making sure it was loaded before stepping outside. The motel parking lot was empty, the flickering streetlight humming softly in the cool night air. The silence was unnatural, too perfect, like the whole town was holding its breath. He scanned the lot for any movement, any sign of who had left the note, but the shadows were thick and undisturbed. Whoever had been there was gone. Ethan exhaled slowly and walked toward his truck. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. The Calloway General Store, 11:45 p.m. The Calloway General Store was where Lena had been last seen alive. It still stood, untouched by time, sitting at the edge of town like a ghost that refused to fade. The wooden sign above the entrance had long since faded, the paint peeling away in curls. A small closed sign hung in the dusty window, but Ethan had a feeling the door wouldn't be locked. He was right. The door creaked open, revealing the dark interior. Ethan stepped inside. The scent of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic filled the air. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with forgotten goods, expired cans, dusty boxes of cereal, newspapers from years past. It was like someone had abandoned it in a hurry. Ethan turned on his flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom. He moved past the counter, the old cash register covered in a fine layer of dust. Then something shifted behind him, a whisper of movement. Ethan froze. His hand went to his gun, heart pounding as he turned. A photograph lay on the counter, half buried beneath old receipts. It hadn't been there before. Ethan reached for it, his fingers brushing the worn edges. It was Lena Calloway, but this wasn't one of the publicly available photos. This one was different. She was afraid. The photo captured her mid-turn, eyes wide, mouth slightly open as if someone had called her name, like she had just seen something she wasn't supposed to see. Ethan's stomach tightened. Then, a thump from the back of the store. He turned, gun raised. "Oh, who's there?" Silence. Then, a shadow darted between the shelves. Someone was in here with him. The chase Ethan moved fast, rounding the shelves just in time to see a figure slip through a side door, disappearing into the night. "Stop!" But the person was already running. Ethan bolted after them, shoving through the door and into the alley behind the store. His boots pounded against the pavement, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Then he saw it, a flash of motion near the old church. Ethan sprinted forward, pushing himself faster. The figure disappeared around the back of the church, slipping into the cemetery beyond. Ethan skidded to a stop at the entrance of the graveyard. The air here felt different, thick, heavy, wrong. Rows of tilted tombstones stretched into the darkness. The names faded with age. And then a figure stood at the far edge of the cemetery, half hidden in the fog. Ethan took a cautious step forward. "Who are you?" The figure didn't move, didn't run, just stood there watching him. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "You shouldn't be here." And before Ethan could respond, the church bell tolled. The warning. Ethan's breath came fast and sharp. The bell's deep, hollow sound echoed through the empty graveyard. And when Ethan looked back, the figure was gone. He scanned the darkness, but there was nothing left but the tombstones. And the feeling that he was being watched. Slowly he turned back toward the street. Whatever was happening in Ashbrook, it was bigger than he thought. And someone, maybe more than one person, was making sure he didn't uncover the truth. Ethan pulled the note from his pocket, rereading the words. "Leave before it's too late." He let out a slow breath. Then he tore the note in half. He wasn't going anywhere, not until he found out what really happened to Lena Calloway. The night air was thick with silence as Ethan walked back toward his truck. Whoever had led him on this chase wanted him to know one thing: he was being watched. And yet they hadn't stopped him. Not yet. He climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors out of instinct. His breath was steady, but his mind was racing. Someone in Ashbrook knew exactly what had happened to Lena Calloway, and someone wanted him gone before he could find out. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the photograph he had taken from the store. Lena's face stared back at him, her expression caught between surprise and fear. It wasn't the first time he had seen that look. It was the look of someone who had just realized they were in danger. Ethan narrowed his eyes, focusing on the background of the photo. The general store was behind her, but beyond that, a familiar white church, the same one where the figure had disappeared into the cemetery. Ethan's grip tightened around the edges of the photo. She had been there. Lena had been near the church the day she vanished. Was that where she had last been seen? Was that where she had died? Ethan tossed the photo onto the dashboard and started the truck. He had his next destination. The church. The Ashbrook Community Church had been standing for over a century, its once bright white walls now dull and weather-worn. Ethan parked just beyond the graveyard, the headlights casting long, twisting shadows between the gravestones. It was quiet, too quiet. Ethan stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching over the damp grass. The night air was colder here, as if the land itself remembered something awful. The church doors were unlocked. Ethan pushed them open. Inside, rows of wooden pews stretched toward the altar, dust thick in the air. Moonlight streamed through the high stained glass windows, bathing the room in hues of red and blue. But Ethan wasn't looking at the windows. He was looking at the floor. Scrape marks, subtle but unmistakable, as if something heavy had been dragged. His pulse quickened. He followed the marks toward the back of the church, past the altar, toward a small wooden door leading to the basement. He tried the handle. Locked. Ethan took a step back, weighing his options. He could force it open, but that would be loud. Then from somewhere beneath the floorboards came a sound, a soft thud. Then another. Footsteps. Ethan's breath hitched. Someone was down there. Buried secrets, Ethan didn't hesitate. He pulled a lockpick from his pocket, one of many skills learned during his time as an investigative journalist, and got to work. A minute later, the lock clicked open. The door creaked as he pushed it inward, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The scent of damp earth and mildew hit him first. He clicked on his flashlight and descended. The basement was cramped and cold, lined with crumbling stone walls. Wooden crates and old church relics were stacked haphazardly, but Ethan barely noticed them. He was focused on the footprints in the dust. Fresh, leading toward the far wall. Ethan followed them, his heart hammering. Then he saw it. A trap door, slightly ajar, as if someone had used it recently. Ethan crouched, gripping the edge and pulling it open. A ladder led downward, into what looked like a hidden tunnel. his stomach twisted. This is it! This was where Lena had gone. This was where the town's secrets had been buried. The truth beneath Ashbrook, Ethan climbed down into the tunnel. The air was stale and thick, the kind of place no one was ever meant to find. His flashlight illuminated stone walls lined with old wooden beams, barely holding up the ceiling. The tunnel stretched farther than he expected, curving deeper beneath the town. Then the smell hit him. Rot, decay, something long dead. Ethan swallowed against the bile rising in his throat and pressed forward. Then he saw them. Bones, not just one, many, some old, some fresh. Ethan's chest tightened. How many people had been taken down here? Then something crunched beneath his boot. He looked down. A bracelet, tarnished, covered in dirt, but still intact. Ethan picked it up, turning it in his fingers. A name was engraved inside the band. Lena Calloway. His breath caught. She had been here. This was where she had died. And suddenly, Ethan knew. Lena's disappearance had never been an accident. She had been taken, and the town had helped cover it up. They knew a sound echoed from deeper in the tunnel. A low shuffle. Not an animal, not the wind. A person. Ethan turned, pistol in hand. Then, from the darkness, a voice. I warned you. A figure stepped forward. A shadow at first, then a face he recognized. Mike, the man who had warned him at the diner. Ethan's grip tightened. You knew about this. Mike's face was unreadable. Everyone in Ashbrook knows. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Everyone? Ethan's mind raced. The silent stares at the diner. The note at his motel door. The way Maggie had told him to leave it alone. They all knew. They had known for years. And no one had done anything. Ethan's jaw clenched. Who did this? Mike didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He tossed it onto the ground. A rusted sheriff's badge. Ethan's stomach dropped. Mike exhaled, his voice grim. Lena never had a chance. Then he looked up, eyes dark with warning. Neither do you. The town that buries its dead. Ethan's pulse pounded. The sheriff, the very man who should have protected Lena, had been the one to bury her instead. The whole town had kept the secret. For decades. And now Ethan was standing in the same place she had died. A place no outsider was meant to find. Mike took a slow step back toward the tunnel's entrance. You should have left when you had the chance. Then, the lights went out. And Ethan knew he wasn't getting out of this without a fight. Thank you for listening to Storytime with Killian Flynn. If you like his stories, go ahead and read some of his books. Check out his bio, links, and description. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to this podcast.